those are the things that get me fired up for work every day. And so, any opportunity to speak with landowners and people who are also excited about the things that I'm excited about make my life a lot easier. So I appreciate the opportunity. So as we get started here, I think it's probably important that we talk about what are grassland birds. So for the purposes of this presentation, and this is debatable, and we could have a lot of contextual discussion about semantics, but for this presentation, we're going to consider grassland birds as species that depend on and select for habitat, where the dominant characteristic plant community is grasses and their associated herbaceous cover, so forbs and grasses, and their associated shrubs here and there in various configurations. And we're talking about birds that require this type of plant community during all or part of their life cycle. So where grasslands supply at least some of what they absolutely must have to survive on a regular basis. So in this context, grassland birds can include anything from migratory birds and resident bird species, waterfowl, raptors, shorebirds, upland game birds, and songbirds. These species are often characterized by either behavioral and or physical adaptations that allow them to take advantage of the high diversity of plant and food resources that are indicative of a dynamically disturbed ecosystem like a prairie. Those same grassland appropriate traits may also have disadvantages if that bird were to find themselves in a different ecosystem. For example, a plant community characterized by dense woody canopies might have disadvantages for one of these birds. So here's our map of some various ecoregions, and just in general, we're talking about grasslands or the Great Plains of the United States and the birds that use this central flyway. These evolutionary specializations that these grassland birds have are usually tied to geographic regions that are characterized by plant communities that those characteristics address. In some cases, seasonal changes in the habitat or their behavior of individual birds for breeding and other purposes cause those birds to be migratory species. And they make a long jump, many of them, from South America to North America. And many of these grassland birds are specialized to the point where they really only prefer to be in grasslands. And so to go from suitable grasslands in South America, so the north end of South America, in Venezuela, there are some major grasslands, but to jump all the way across the tropical forests or desert regions of Central America and Mexico, this southeastern grasslands of Texas are an important respite for many of those migratory species. Effectively boxed in by woodlands of the Edwards Plateau to the west, piney woods to the east, grassland migratory birds are funneled in and out of the southern Great Plains twice a year directly through the geography of the Fayette Prairie. I'm gonna provide some overview of a few of the grassland birds that you might observe living in and passing through the prairies of this region. So first off, credit where credit is due. In order to help us picture these migrations, I'm going to be using these extremely excellent abundance visualizations that come from the Cornell Bird Lab. And these track eBird observer reports every week throughout the year. They publish this bird conservation visualization and other data tools to be used for research and education purposes. So they graciously allow pretty free use of this for educational purposes. These data sets include range and abundance maps and habitat selection models, just a huge ocean of incredible information for over 1,000 species of birds And I highly recommend that if you get a chance, an opportunity, if it's interesting to you at all, search up eBird visualizations. And I mean, just dive into the data set and these tools to help you visualize this data. I literally, preparing for this, I spent hours just getting lost in various birds, some relevant to this presentation and some not. I'm going to start our species here with what might be the longest traveler, the upland sandpiper. These long distance migrators winter almost exclusively in Argentina, the grasslands of South America, and they migrate up through Central America and funnel straight through Texas in that area that we were talking about and into the Great Plains. They go all the way up to the northern Great Plains and spend most of their summer months primarily in the Dakotas, and then pass back through Texas come September. While they look like a shorebird, these guys apply those physical traits to pick invertebrates out of short and dense vegetation. They'll eat some seeds, but primarily they're looking for soil invertebrates. They strongly select against woody cover. So that means that they're typically found in large open grasslands, far away from anything that resembles a raptor perch. And they're going to be attracted to things like recently burned fields or hayed patches of grassland. And because these areas are a little easier to forage. In the regions where they do their reproduction in the northern Great Plains, they look for a thicker thatch layer, but still not very tall vegetation, and they hide their nests there in that type of cover. But in Texas, that's less of a priority. Generally, they're just passing through.
Thank you.
Twice a year.
Macro.
If we take a little bit closer look to, this is a little bit older map that shows the same thing in a little different way, we can really see how their dislike of woody structure creates this firm eastern boundary along the Texas piney woods. And this kind of guides them north towards the shortgrass prairies as they move up on the map. The convergence of those unhospitable woody plants of the South Texas brushland causes them to really value their landing spot in Southeast Texas in the first available grasslands they hit. But they're also kind of being pushed east by the Edwards Plateau, the shrublands of the Edwards Plateau, and those piney woods really box them in and push them north. They really follow those tree lines north straight into the shorter grass prairies of the northern Great Plains. Okay, the dick sisal overwinters in Venezuela, so northern South America grasslands, and breeds throughout the central and southern Great Plains. So again, we have one that some of them stay here as they're migrating north, but many of them continue on north into the Great Plains, really kind of hanging out in Nebraska and Kansas, and then funneling back down through Texas at the end of the summer. They too also prefer open grasslands. They're kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum, though, from the upland sandpiper when it comes to what type or what structure of herbaceous plant cover they prefer. The dick sisal prefers dense, medium to very tall grasses and forbs. They need a high density of forbs for both cover and for the food that they eat. They nest directly on the ground. Sometimes when the cover is dense enough, you'll find those nests in really thick thatch up to 30 inches above the ground, but not in woody cover, not usually in trees or shrubs. So only if that grass thatch is dense enough will it be up off the ground. They select against both forested and sparse herbaceous cover. So they're really looking for these mature perennial grasses and forbs that will adequately hide their nests. And then they'll forage outside of those high density areas and inside of them. But if there's lower vegetation nearby, that's where they'll do a lot of their foraging. Painted buntings are a little less obligated to grassland plant communities and more associated with grassland patches that are also in close proximity to woodlands. They really rely on the edges between these habitat types to meet all of their habitat requirements. The geography of Texas as a whole hosts an estimated 60 to 80% of the nesting habitat for this species. And we really see that on this map. You see as they migrate north, Texas really pops out at high density. That's where the summer months we really see these birds being visible, or because of their visual traits, and because of their distinctive song, they're readily observed on these edge habitats. You can look for colorful males perched about 6 to 10 feet up, usually on the edges of dense woody cover, as they call throughout the day during the summer breeding months. They rely on that dense woody cover for nesting. They nest in the trees, but also to screen their courtship behavior, because the males are so visually eye-catching. They're vulnerable to predators if they're completely out in the open. So they really need that dense woody edge for that courtship behavior. But they also utilize the abundant invertebrates and seed food resources that you can only find in grassland patches. So this makes them a really prime example of an edge species, where they got to have that grassland for the food, but they really got to have that dense woody edge also. Another grassland facultative species is the loggerhead shrike, also sometimes known as the butcher bird. These guys are commonly found in southeastern Texas throughout the winter, with a portion of the population kind of migrating north through the Great Plains to breed throughout the summer. These guys are similar in some ways to the requirements for painted buntings, because shrikes need characteristics of both shrublands and grasslands, but they're less of an edge species. More so, they require shrubs scattered throughout open patches of grassland for foraging. They also rely on sparse vertical structures, so a tree every once in a while, usually young single-stemmed trees, provide open perches to ambush their prey from above. And usually they'll also nest in similar structure about 8 to 15 feet up in individual standing trees. In fact, one of the highest concentrations of loggerhead shrikes is in a parking lot near Round Rock. There's it's a vacant parking lot where they planted a perfect distribution of oak trees in a parking lot, and those birds find that structure appealing for their nesting, and then they'll defend that territory. So those breeding pairs will kill prey species and then mark their territory by impaling those animals on the spines of woody plants found in the area. If they don't have spines from those woody shrubs, they will also stab them onto barbed wire fences. So one cool thing here, their beaks are nearly raptorial. This allows them to almost indiscriminately take any small vertebrate, anything smaller than their own full body size, all the way down to insects as prey. You can look for these guys out on their perches in the wintertime. When the leaves are off the mesquite trees, you might see them sort of perched on the side or on the top of the mesquite tree as a perch to ambush their prey. And you might also be able to find their victims speared along fence lines or the edges of shrublands, out, as long as those are surrounded by open grassland. Another Texas wintering bird would be the savanna sparrow. These guys are extremely common and in high densities from November through April, before they head north through the Great Plains during the summer months. So you might see these guys, small mottled brown birds, flitting back and forth through dense clumps of dormant grass cover during the winter. They're still around right now. I see them outside my office window pretty frequently, but they pop in and out of that dense cover and scratch for seeds on the patches of bare ground throughout those winter months. Texas is really important for these sparrows and many other grassland sparrow species that do their breeding in the northern Great Plains, but almost all of them come down in winter in Texas and Oklahoma. The smaller species have a little bit harder of a time migrating longer distances, especially when they can find what they need here. So far, we've talked about selection preferences for grassland birds, and they've ranged pretty widely, even some major contradictions between the specifics on what they need. short to tall grasses, lots of forbs, a few forbs, some woody cover, no woody cover. The distribution of those shrubs is different for a few of the species. And then the size of the patches itself have varied pretty greatly. So how are we supposed to manage a prairie to ensure that you're doing your part to provide habitat for these species? This is where we can lean into some of the grassland ecology principles that have been discussed at length in some of the previous Fayette Prairie, Native Prairies Association presentations. Chris Helzer, the prairie ecologist, described prairies as disturbance-oriented communities, and I agree. A disturbance makes the prairie. The timing, intensity, and extent of those disturbances determine the structure and composition of the plant community. And subsequently, the vertebrate population and bird species that use them for food and other resources that the prairie attracts and supports are all determined by those disturbances. This patch of prairie could be managed entirely for upland sandpipers, and it could be achieved through mowing, annual burning, or intense grazing of grass-dominated fields. The Flint Hills of Nebraska or of Kansas are burned every year for grass forage production, and every year after that recovery begins, it's optimal sandpiper habitat. And if we were to take another look at that migratory map, you would see the Flint Hills really explode on that map, and that's because they're attracted to that type of disturbance, and they really utilize the resultant cover. Most of this patch, however, would be a pretty lonely place in Texas for most of the year. It lacks the structure and function critical to all those other bird species. This more diverse patch of still kind of recovering from some kind of disturbance of this prairie recovers a bit more quickly because of all this high diversity of forbs that we can see down in this low vegetation. But it still, because of its structure, doesn't really have usable space for all of the species. But the edges here on the perimeter, in the distance, you can see the tree line and the dense shrubs along the tree lines there and the fence lines might be good for painted buntings that then come out into this open area for foraging. Conversely, this is a mature stand of big blue stem, dense with sunflowers. An area like this is dickcissel heaven, April through September. It doesn't have anything for a sandpiper, and without an adjacent woodland edge, you probably wouldn't find a painted bunting here either. Savanna sparrows would probably find all the winter cover and foraging that they need in this patch, which is a 3-year prairie restoration planting. But if the whole patch looks like this, loggerhead shrikes would be hard pressed to find an ambush perch or a tree to nest in. So what if we want to manage with a goal to provide habitat requirements for multiple grassland bird species? It is possible to make a plan for diversity by varying your type of disturbance, the intensity and timing applied to portions of your prairie, not all at once, but in portions, to ensure that you have heterogeneity of structure and function available throughout the year for various species. When you make these comprehensive plans, it can be helpful to reference a model, a template to measure your habitat against to ensure that you're providing what is required for various species without having to be an intimate expert on what each of these birds needs. If we hit the targets for our model, we know that everything's getting what we need and we'll have a functional, healthy prairie. The northern bobwhite is often considered an umbrella species for grassland birds because it requires diverse range of plant community functions and structures in order to make the area usable and support a population of birds, especially true throughout the grasslands of the Southern Great Plains in Texas. They also find some habitat use in the savannas in the Southeast for similar structural reasons. But I want you guys to picture quail habitat through Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas and Nebraska. As a non-migratory bird species, they have to have everything they need within close proximity, and that has to be throughout the entire year. So not just during the spring, not just during the fall, during those migratory periods, but throughout the year in order to stay and have a viable population in a given area. These are small chicken-like birds, and bobwhites are desirable prey species for pretty much everything else on the food web. They prefer not to fly unless it's to avoid predators. You're not going to see them flying from one field over to another field in order to find food. They're really only going to take to the air to avoid a predator. And in that case, they're flying as short a distance as possible and diving straight into the densest cover that they can find. If they travel any distance away from suitable screening or escape cover, that's pretty much a death sentence for a quail. So if they've got to travel more, I would say more than a couple hundred yards from one habitat type to another to find what they need, they're just out in the open, and they're probably going to be predated either by raptors or mammals. These guys are about the size of a softball, and they lay around a dozen eggs in a nest directly on the ground with minimal vegetation to make the nest cup. Bobwhites prefer to hide those clutches under the canopy provided by native bunch grasses and some of the associated herbaceous cover. Adequate cover is critical and often the limiting factor for habitat suitability for bobwhites. This little bluestem dominated prairie site is ideal for nesting cover, but it's not just the presence of the grass that makes the structure and overall composition of this stand ideal. The quantity and adequately sized mature grass clumps make for a multitude of nesting options that don't make it easy for a predator to find a nest. The density, however, is also important. It's tight enough to provide visual cover from afar, but importantly, not so dense as to impede the travel by chicks, which are about the size of a ping pong ball, that as soon as they hatch, begin foraging for insects. Too dense, and they won't be able to move through that habitat and use it effectively, and they become vulnerable to predators themselves. Also, too much density would choke out the diversity of those seed-producing invertebrate-hosting forbs and wildflowers that are the food for the chicks and the adults throughout the whole year. Within a short flush from anywhere in this field, there is dense, low to the ground, woody shrub cover, which is perfect for evading predators, but it's not so tall or dense or expansive as to take away the functionality of the forbs and bunch grasses. And none of it is as tall enough to provide perches for ambushing raptors that would be a threat to something the size of a quail. Maybe big enough for a loggerhead shrike, but probably not big enough for a Cooper's hawk. There's a lot here for quail, but this site would also be attractive for many of our other grassland birds for the reasons that we talked about in their habitat requirements. During the winter, this dormant material provided by those bunch grasses and forbs provides ground cover and thermal refuge sought after by things like savanna sparrows. And those sunflowers in the previous shot have dropped plenty of seeds to sustain the sparrows and the bobwhites through the winter. In order to keep this stand from getting too dense, seasonal grazing or prescribed fire might be applied, which would then result in optimal conditions on those patches for those upland sandpipers that might be moving through the area come the following summer. But we wouldn't want to apply that disturbance to the entire area all at the same time. More habitat is always better. Big areas of space that completely meet requirements for a species support more individuals of that species. But uniformity in that habitat might not bode well for all species we want to attract. Application of a disturbance over an entire area could make it either wholly desirable or completely unusable for a given species, depending on which one we're talking about. Instead of uniformity in structure, dictated in this case on a prairie by the age of the prairie or the time since its last disturbance, let's picture a tract of grassland having a patchy quality to the distribution of plant structures with as much diversity in the species of plants as possible. Younger patches would be less dense, shorter, also providing less escape cover, but also in this case, with a high diversity of forbs, there's a lot of invertebrates that are attracted to those forbs, and most of them are going to produce seeds that are the food source during the winter months during this recovery of these grasslands. Right now in this picture, this is great for upland sandpipers. Bobwhite chicks would be able to move freely through this type of stubble and pick out easy access to invertebrates, but they would be exposed to predation. If the whole area was like this, any nests would be completely out in the open. Shrikes or dip thistles might be able to use it for foraging if it's also in close proximity to the nesting and roosting cover that they need. But if it's not, they can't use it. But if we look again at our diagram, maybe we have that patch here as a young patch with the Y on our diagram. Maturing patches, the M here, could be characterized by a higher density, slightly more functional structure for our nesting species that nest on the ground. As this grass becomes taller and thicker, herbaceous cover makes it usable for dick thistles and bobwhites. It may be less appealing to that sandpiper, but he's still going to find what he needs by avoiding the areas that rub him the wrong way. He'll find what he needs in those younger patches that have been recently disturbed. Older patches would be our dense cover, maybe even host some sprouting woody plants if the time since disturbance has been long enough. This characteristic escape and thermal cover is kind of reaching its climax stage for what we would consider a grassland. And it's really primed for a disturbance, a reset. So this would be the O on our diagram. So we need some of these areas that are ready. They're the next ones to be treated with the disturbance. On their own, each of these patches provides some portion of a particular species habitat requirements during a given part of the year. For bobwhites, these functional structures must be in close proximity in order to make the entire area usable as habitat. But what happens when another year passes? When the age of these patches advance, the young becomes maturing, and maturing becomes old, and old just gets older and maybe further away from diversity that we want in both structure and species. Any plan to implement management disturbance should also include changes to where that disturbance is going to occur each year. Rotating which patch receives a disturbance ensures that a patch of each structural stage is available somewhere in the area at all times throughout the year. On paper, this example sort of implies that we'd have a 3-year rotation. You might be tempted to split up your prairie into easy to divide geometric shapes and then apply management on a tight schedule. While certainly that would be much better than no management or poor management, we might be able to come up with a different or better strategy. I borrowed this fine example of some artwork from Chris Helzer, and in it we can see that its representation of the real world is not a uniform canvas to be bent to our will and put on paper in a tight plan. In the real world, slope, soil variation, and infrastructure like fences and property boundaries determine small-scale growing conditions for plants that vary across your area. Some spots in a field are going to have deeper soils and more moisture than others. You might find spots like this, you might find taller, thicker grasses and Maximilian sunflowers fighting it out and creating a dense vegetation in the process. This predicates the need maybe for a faster rotation in those areas. We come back and hit it more frequently with that disturbance. Or maybe we leave them as that mature refuge of dense material, but maybe we don't want a whole bunch of that cover over the whole area. Other spots could be on a slope or have thinner soils that drain more quickly and would give an advantage to forbs and lower statured grasses that require disturbance a little less frequently. So we can't just blanket plan every 3 years of, this particular acre receives that particular treatment. We got to mix it up. It's important to implement management for a purpose. Evaluate your current conditions on a given patch and apply disturbance that will help you in that patch reach an age cycle that meets the habitat needs for the species you're managing for. Consider also the rest of the field in that decision. You don't want to put yourself in a place where none of the pasture has been managed for the same amount of time or is receiving the same treatment at the same time. You want to make sure that your decision making is leading you to habitat, to a prairie that meets all the habitat requirements for all the species you're managing for throughout the year. So how many acres do we need? How big does it need to be? How much prairie? Bigger habitat patches are always better. There's no easy way around it. And no number of acres, however, will be able to completely satisfy the needs of a migratory bird species. And you're never going to be able to have a big enough piece of property that's managed intensely enough to sustain a population of quail on its own as a resident species. We need a landscape of habitat. However, we live in a fragmented landscape, and each of us are limited to how much native prairie we can be good stewards of. The good news is that grassland species are relatively flexible and have a lot of slack in what they can use as far as structure for the habitat to get by, to meet their needs and survive. They don't need perfect, they need connectivity, and they need diversity fueled resilience in the prairie. The more diversity we have in those plant species, the more conditions they can stand up to, and the more flexibility you have with your management. Even in minimally viable habitat patches, even those minimum size patches have disappeared across our landscape. And that's widening fragmentation across the habitat that's necessary. But that means that your effort to improve quality and maximize usable space on the piece that you control could dramatically improve survival for an individual of a given species that uses your prairie. And that in turn could contribute immeasurably to the viability of a species as a whole. More and bigger habitat patches are the goal. But in a vast landscape with sparse habitat resources, every acre of high quality habitat matters. So once you're achieving your goal on your acres that you manage, it might be time to extend your strategy to your amicable neighbors. Share your successes. So how much is going to cost to manage? What does restoring and managing a native prairie that provides that habitat for these grassland birds, what does that look like? I like to look at cost for restoration as an investment and the management of that restoration as protecting your investment. Restorative practices at the bottom of this pyramid are really intense and expensive. These are corrective actions. These are things that we have to do in order to get you back on track after years of mismanagement or no management that are not compatible with the structure and status and diversity of a native prairie, and therefore not providing the required habitat characteristics for those various bird species. They should, however, be a one-time expense. As long as you've planned out some maintenance that's appropriate to manage that structure and diversity, this is a one-time deal. You put down some cash. There are various programs available. It's a big investment up front, to remove invasive woody brush or reseed things with a native seed mix that's highly diverse. Maintenance practices, however, are much cheaper. They typically mimic natural disturbance and create usable space over extensive areas instead of intensely targeting individual areas. Prescribed grazing, for example, has some associated upfront costs to establish some infrastructure like water distribution and fencing, but maybe end up being profitable enough to fund other management activities on the prairie. Prescribed fire requires creation of fire breaks. It takes a contribution and investment of time and effort and expertise and training in order to plan and conduct a burn with the help of some of your friends. But compared to mechanical brush management at hundreds to thousands of dollars per acre, or intensive reseeding projects at similar cost, a prescribed fire is a drop in the bucket as far as cost goes. Good management saves you money in the long run. Really excellent management can end up making you money. I want to wrap up by encouraging any willing and able prairie stewards to actively manage for grassland birds as a way to create and maintain healthy and functional prairies, no matter what your motivation is for that prairie. Here's a few tips that I think about frequently when advising people about planning the management long-term of your prairie. First off, have a plan. Plan and expect to have to manage a prairie. Those disturbances are a required part of the ecosystem. You should seek to maximize usable space on every acre that you can influence. This is going to hold more species of birds and more of them if you can make all of the acres under your control the best that they can. Set some goals that are realistic and understand how you might go about achieving those goals. And then part of that people often forget or leave out is determining what your limitations might be for managing a given acre. If you're completely unable or unwilling to implement prescribed fire on the acres of your prairie, that's a limitation. And we need to understand that limitation, what we're giving up when we make that decision, and also what our options are for mimicking that disturbance in another way. Certainly we'll be limited. We're not going to completely replace the impact of fire with other practices, but maybe it's easier for you to mow or bale hay, or maybe grazing for a short period of time is a tool that's easier for you to implement than applying prescribed fire. Evaluate those options, understand those limitations, and then I encourage you to revisit those decisions on a regular basis. Things change. Maybe your mind changes about how to use fire or grazing, and maybe your financial circumstances to implement that infrastructure change. Maybe you buy the piece of property next to you and you can make it bigger and more viable for a grazing situation. Things change, your plan and your management limitations change also. Prepare for that management in advance. Again, if we're going to do grazing, we got to have fences and water distribution. If we're going to do prescribed fire, you got to plan out, think about burn units. What patch? Never burning more than a third of your total acres at a time. We need to have patches that we can safely burn, set up with fire breaks. And you need to do that in advance. Be prepared for the right conditions, the right capacity of folks to help you on a burn to get it done. Then you want to, I like to prioritize those disturbances that mimic natural processes. Again, they're often cheaper, they're usually easier and less intense applications of disturbance, and more conducive with the evolution of the plant community and the wildlife species that use that habitat. I encourage everyone to aggressively control invasive and encroaching species. So herbaceous species, exotic grasses that have been planted for various reasons, or are purely invasive species should be terminated post haste. Stay on top of those invasive species. they represent to me a long-term management hurdle that never really goes away once they're established. And in order to address them, even periodically, it can be a large investment for those management practices. And we lose some of the more extensive, low-cost options for managing those things. And I would also apply that to brush management. If you have an area that you're managing as a prairie that's supposed to be grassland, keep the brush out of it for the most part. Pockets of brush of native species that provide that structural habitat, great. An area being encroached entirely and taken over, grasses and forbs being pushed out and replaced with shrubs, not great. That represents a long-term maintenance issue that will require a huge investment of funds to address later. Probably the most important thing on this list is to be adaptive. If conditions weren't correct to get a planned fire done, maybe you have to change your plan. Let the circumstances on the ground determine what your actions are. When possible, default to management that produces diversity. And that's diversity in the species, the structure, the functions, and the timing of those applied disturbances. I think we'll end it there. I'm a little over, I'm sure. With this, here's a picture of a quail chick on a recently burned and recovering patch of prairie. I'd be happy to take any questions, grassland birds, or further discuss bird habitat or prairie restoration if we have the time. But I certainly want to point out some of the resources I use on a regular basis and I used for this presentation. The Oaks and Prairies Joint Venture website's listed here on the screen. And also the Cornell Bird Lab that I mentioned in eBird program listed here as well. With that, I'll take any questions if we have time, Gary.